Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today I have a real thrill. I'll tell you a secret. 60-ish years ago, I was a graduate student in sociology in Berkeley, and I had a summer job working as a research assistant for Professor William Kornhauser. And we spent a lot of time talking. I did a lot more just visiting and chatting and theorizing with him than I did actual work. I don't even remember what my work was, but I had a good summer. And about then, his wife had a baby, and uh, and
Meta, you just dated me, but that's okay.
so I wondered a few months ago. I started thinking, whatever happened to that baby? I never saw that baby. So I thought, I'm going to look it up. So I typed Kornhauser in my Google, and here came up a woman named Anne Kornhauser, who it turns out to be the chairman of the Department of History at the City College of New York. So I gave her a note and said, you want to chat and get acquainted? And she did. So we said hi to each other a couple of times. And I found out that she'd written an extremely interesting book about liberalism in America. And, well, I guess the US almost exclusively, I don't know. But it turned out, really an interesting argument that I had never heard before. So I thought we ought to do a show about this. And the book was actually published about 11 years ago. So I think things have changed a lot in the United States with Trump and all the other folks. And I want to see not only what she thought then, but what she thinks is going on now. And so I invited her. And then I thought, oh, I also have another friend who'd love to meet Anne Kornhauser, I bet. And that's Doug Saunders. He is, I call him the head honcho in international affairs at the Globe and Mail. I don't know what your official title is, but he's a big shot. And he travels a lot and he knows stuff. So I thought he'd be a really good conversationalist today, and I invited him to join us. So hello, both of you, Anne and Doug. And I
Hello.
and you look a little bit like your dad. I'd like you to give us a kind of a summary of your book. I don't know, 10 minutes or so, however long it takes, of what your argument was then. And then let's dive into considering what has been going on in the United States ever since then. Is that okay?
Yes, it's fine. I don't know if I can talk for 10 minutes about the book, but I'll
Whatever.
I'll make it I'll do what I can. Um I mean, I think anyway. So, let me start by saying that when I went to Columbia University, which is where I did my doctoral work under Eric Foner, actually, who's more of a 19th century historian, but I had a lot of great resources there from political science as well. I've always been a bit of a cross-disciplinary type. I did not follow my parents' footsteps in sociology, but I was really interested in liberalism. I didn't know exactly how I was going to write about it when I went into graduate school, which would probably be a no-no today. Not, I mean, I really didn't know. I just knew that I wanted to write about it. Why? Because I grew up in Berkeley, as you have said, Meta, where liberalism as a concept, as a word, let me just say from the start, I'm interested in political liberalism. Okay, it is applied to other domains, but this is my interest. Broadly speaking, I don't just mean in government or whatever, but the political conceptualization and programs of liberalism. So in Berkeley in the 70s, when I was growing up, even into the early 80s, it was kind of a dirty word from the left, and I was involved in left-wing politics, anti-war stuff, and Local politics, very involved, too involved probably for my academic work. But so I became really, so that was one sort of experience. And then I went to college, sort of continued my lefty proclivities, by which at that point I mean, well, Berkeley too, Marxist, actually, studying it at that point. And then became the editor of the newspaper, though, and that I did not do as the Columbia Daily Spectator. I did not do that as a Marxist per se. And I was also slowly sort of, at least in my practical politics, I guess I would have called myself then and do today a left liberal, or in European terms, a social democrat. So that I don't really think matters that much, actually, but I just put it out there. So then I worked as a journalist in Washington, D.C. for about 4 or 5 years before going to back to Columbia to graduate school. And there, so that would have been late 80s, early 90s. So under Republican, for the most part, Republican leadership. And then liberalism again was anathema, this time, though, more from the right. And I just thought, why is this phenomenon or idea, however much truth there was to the, imagery of liberalism, why was it so much of a lightning rod? And particularly considering isn't still, and that's whether it's in the context of the Democratic Party or more generally, it's not that well defined or grasped, and I'm not sure it can be, because I'm not sure it represents a single thing. Anyway, so that's the background to why I decided to write about liberalism. But I also became increasingly interested in state power. Part of that goes back to, that was an influence of my father, the political sociologist, whose main claim to fame was writing about totalitarianism, as one did in the Cold War years.
Mass
Also,
society.
what?
Mass society was
exactly the potential, actually, for totalitarian tendencies. This should be resonant now in what were called more pluralistic societies. And anyway, among other things, that was. But so the big moment for liberalism, when it was called by its name in connection to the Democratic Party, was under Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the New Deal in the 1930s. That was very self-conscious. And here I'm going to probably disagree a bit with my brilliant colleague, Helena Rosenblatt, who wrote an exceptional book on a much broader history of liberalism in European and the United States context. I think that that there was a big effort to distinguish liberalism in political rhetoric from progressivism, which was the kind of liberal-ish precursor, right, in the early part of the 20th century among politicians, journalists, and there was a capital P progressive movement. So I thought, let me look at liberalism in a particular period, in a particular place, right? The one that we've inherited, really, the one that connected itself to a very activist central state, central government, that claimed a lot of problem-solving attributes, but that also, and this is Roosevelt, but it caught on, that also distinguished itself, as I said, from progressivism in demoralizing its picking out the moralistic content that often went along with progressive ideas, things, So under progressivism, you get prohibition. Under New Deal, Roosevelt, you get the repeal of it. I mean, there are many reasons for that, economic and otherwise, but one of them was certainly the moralism that was attended the notion that people, that we needed to make it harder for Americans to drink. But, just in general, the idea that government would be put to the would be used for sort of moral guidance and education and stuff. That it's not that they rejected it so much as they downplayed it. Well, there was some rejection of it actually as well. So what do you have instead? What is liberalism under the New Deal? Well, I already said a little bit about it, but let me say a little bit more. So just to say again, I call it in my book statist liberalism, to try to define this emergent political liberalism that self-consciously, right, through the Democratic Party and others, forged, not a radically new path, but one that was supposed to be somewhat new and different, much more activist. I mean, look, the conditions under which it was forged, and that's very important, were, catastrophic, right? A global depression, unlike anything anybody in our lifetime has lived through as an adult anyway. And then not long after that, of course, a global war, total war. So, I'm not saying that liberalism created emergency conditions, but it had to, whatever the ideology, the governing ideology was anywhere, had to respond to these conditions. Well, not anywhere, but most places. So, and the state was the most powerful set of institutions. Really the only thing that could address this level of crisis. And I think that was accepted, but the degree to which the state would get involved in the economy, in society, in other non-state institutions was always up for debate. And the ends to which that involvement, right, would be placed. But there really was in this country, including during the 1930s, though somewhat tempered then because of the conditions, a long-standing debate about how powerful the central government should be. Not so common in a place like Canada. Maybe some of that because you have the federal structure there too. Sorry, I won't talk about Canada. Let's say
there's a little bit of that, but it hasn't created quite as many quite as dramatic interruptions.
Yes, and so but Western European countries probably a better example. But the federalist system that we have, in which states have their own governments and constitutionally a fair amount of power, also, adds to this. So the growth of the centralized state, the bureaucratic state, which is what was already going on in the progressive period, but really, as I say in my book, increased dramatically in this period. Again, a lot of that was of necessity. They had to just do a lot more, create jobs, try to stabilize the economy, try to create more opportunity, frankly, and less inequality. Protect people and give them better security in old age and sickness. And, these kinds of things became much more pressing when, the economic circumstances were so dire. So in this context, I looked at what liberalism as it was articulated by mostly intellectuals, because that's my area of interest, but also the interface of that articulation with government, as I've been mentioning, Roosevelt, government actors. And I came up with 3 what I call dilemmas or tensions that I thought kind of described the growing pains and overall sort of uncertainties about this effort to have a statist liberalism at this moment. And I have to remind myself here, the unelected bureaucracy, right, and hierarchical bureaucracy with a lot of power in the executive, but also in administrative government, which grew hugely through agencies at this time, versus more democratic, participatory, and representative, so Congress, majoritarian usually, but a commitment to majoritarian democracy in various guises. Second, where was the place of the rule of law? This is also familiar in a liberal administrative state. Why? Because administration isn't the same thing as law, and discretion, which comes with appointed officials and bureaucratic organizations, is much more prevalent in this kind of state. So that is not the same thing as the rule of law. I'm not saying as law, although there's some of that too, but I'm interested in the rule of law. That is the norm that says, there should be legal constraints on government power, but also legal protections, right, for citizens, and in some cases non-citizens, but also and in some ways, particularly for minorities in a majoritarian democracy. But so two things: how the government itself operates is subject to law. That's always been the case, but constitutionally always been the case, right? But I'm saying that it became a much more salient issue under these conditions of administrative growth and emergency. And then the third one was, threats, probably the most obvious, to individual autonomy and liberty posed by a much bigger, more powerful government state. So I'll just say a couple last things. So I looked at, as I said, mostly thinkers, some American, they're all American, but some native-born American social scientists. I have a couple chapters on them and how they often worked in or with the New Deal state, and then what concerns were they raising by this very rapid growth in this particular way. Second, I looked at some German emigres who had mostly been social democrats in Germany and had come up in Weimar. Again, I know this is all weirdly familiar, but they also often worked in government and advised government, especially during World War II, as you can imagine. And what were they saying, given their experience of watching a democratic republic, right, dissolve into a totalitarian Nazi state? And then then the structure of the book's a little weird this way, and the sort of apotheosis of all this, or the way that I decided to trace this lineage that I was exploring, was by looking at the political philosopher John Rawls, who at the time had not been studied that much. I could have and maybe should have written a whole book on him, but then someone else did it anyway, so it's okay. But he, I thought, could be read. So did this person, actually, or, maybe independently, or maybe thought I made a good argument. I don't know. I thought he could be seen as someone grappling with all three of these dilemmas and trying to resolve them in theory, or at least begin to resolve them. So, try to find ways to have, to preserve the democratic dimensions of government, to focus on the rule of law, and most importantly for him, to look at the role of individuals in this new, very bureaucratized and sort of just alien, form of government. By alien, I mean that the people are more alienated from highly bureaucratic structures generally. As you know, we all know this from experience, and this applies in the private sector as well. I happen to be talking about public bureaucracy, right? But the layers and layers of, things you have to go through.
Well, the thing I enjoy is you pointed out ambivalences in my own thinking that I was not aware of, and I had not identified the extent to which my anxieties about bureaucratic, I don't want to say the deep state, but by God, they got
okay.
and I hadn't really thought through how mixed my own feelings are about whether or not I'm I'm liking big government and I want more of it, or whether I want to chop it up and make sure that there are little cracks where human beings can intervene and say, hey, here I am, pay attention to me. So
sorry, on that note, may I just interject quickly? I won't do this again, I promise.
Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't promise, but there was one other aspect to my argument that I didn't mention that goes to this, which is that given the conditions that I already described, under which this public philosophy, for lack of a better word, or political program that supported a greater bureaucratic presence was forged, there wasn't and I don't know if there can be, but there wasn't any kind of much of a normative justification or principled justification for this. So I think Metta, you and all of us partly are part of the dilemma in our own head has to do with Rawls tried at a very high philosophical level, but that's not going to really resonate in everyday life.
I'm going to ask Doug's reaction to this. Yesterday, he and I had a debate, or not a debate, but a discussion about what is liberalism, what is neoliberalism, and what is neoconism.
Okay. Let's
but nevertheless,
let's not try to draw those lines today, because I mean, Anne, why I'm really grateful to have you here talking at this moment in 2026 is because you wrote about in Debating the American State about an inflection point in the creation of the modern American bureaucratic state, the liberal state, as it has existed since the interwar years in the United States, and the overarching and unresolved question of its legitimacy as a de facto branch of government. And in the decade and a bit since you published it, there's been another inflection point caused by what I think was just emerging at that time from some corners of the American right and the right in other countries, which was to use the phrase the administrative state to describe everything that was wrong with the liberal state from their perspective. And then, of course, in the last 2 years, the rise of the second Trump administration as a very direct and violent challenge to the administrative state as an enemy and its organized overthrow. I mean, the first couple months of Trump 2 with Elon Musk's organization were 100% devoted explicitly to shutting down the bureaucratic institutions of the modern state. And I have to say, it's a form of politics. The note you mentioned, the deep state as a concept, Metta, I first heard that from people who we would maybe call on the right in Turkey in the 1990s. And from people on the far left, actually, who would talk about the deep state as being in the wake of the military coup, that it was really this bureaucracy that ran everything, that ran all the actual elected people. And I was surprised to hear that concept leaping after 2016 out of its Middle Eastern origins to become a popular term uttered by the President of the United States to describe his own public service as an enemy. So let me ask you, this second inflection point, did you anticipate as a way that those tensions that you outlined, that tension of legitimacy in the bureaucratic state it would be resolved?
Did I anticipate it would be resolved? Oh God!
In this particular
way? This way, absolutely not.
Well, because a lot of what you talk about in this history is the left's or scholars who are to the left of the center of gravity of the American liberal state, critiquing its tensions and contradictions and crises of legitimacy.
Yes.
It's interesting, though. I mean, the Trump administration just released this, 2,000 page or something outline of the reforms it wants to make to a lot of bureaucratic things, and a lot of it is introducing new subsidies for favored industries and that sort of thing, which is stuff that requires a bureaucratic apparatus and so on. So I'll wait till you finish.
I'm really sorry. I had to reflect.
Sorry. I say the Trump administration had just recently released this voluminous outline of the reforms it wants to make to all sorts of things, which includes a lot of subsidies to favored industries. I think the New York Times focused on the chicken farming subsidies and these sorts of things, which will require, its own bureaucratic infrastructure to be implemented and so on. I'll please continue, but I do want to ask you about what point we're seeing in a certain cycle of power and institutionalization as a result of that. But just continue that thought, please.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that comment. Actually, it's very well taken, and I was generalizing in a way that I don't even agree with, but one tries to do these things sometimes in these contexts. But let's get it a little more granular. So it wouldn't, to be more precise, right? It's not simply the relationship that the Trump administration is trying to forge with capitalist institutions is not simply anti-government interference. Let's say that. The regulatory stuff, I think, it's not even just anti-regulatory, because as you point out, there are other, there are different kinds of regulation. And I did say in my book something that I think is very important that still holds, which is this landscape of politics in this country, and certainly not now, but even until recently, has not best described as big government versus small government, because it's really always been about, to what end, as I said, do you want to use government, right? And who decides? So those are the two things that are up for contest, not so much should there be, government power. Now, there is some through line that I think has been pretty much destroyed by the second Trump administration of, concern about centralized government versus, right, the federal government versus states. But if you take it in totality, I think there's a general appreciation, as there is for people all over the world, that, collective action in the form of public power needs to take place. So, sorry, go ahead.
What's an interesting development that I think hasn't really fully played out yet is that because power is distributed in the United States, it's a federal state, and states have a lot of powers. In the last 2 years, we've started to see the seeds of what you might call an emerging counter-administration at the pseudo-federal level. And the best example of... Okay, but this is what I mean. The best example of this is when the Department of Health and Human Services began to get rid of vaccination and funding for vaccination. And also the Supreme Court and other institutions started to roll back reproductive freedom and abortion rights and so on.
Okay.
We have seen coalitions of states, Democratic governed states that aren't into that, forming their networks of support. There's a medicine procurement network there was a West Coast one that had the West Coast states in it, and I think late last year it joined up with an East Coast one to create what sort of I thought as looked like the seeds of a counter bureaucracy or counter administration.
Right.
And there's a couple other fields, including reproductive issues, where you're starting to see this, that the states are joining, the states that aren't into it, the Trump agenda, are forming their own counter administration at the, I guess you wouldn't call it federal, but at the trans-state level or interstate level.
Interstate compacts, they're called.
Is okay. There is a name for this, then. Yes.
Well, in one context, I was doing a little research before this program, and to see, how people who are trying to think about counteracting, right, the Trump administration in this context, what were they thinking about? And I came across that.
I think that's a unique thing. I mean, I have to say, I'm very glad to be here with both of you, because I've increasingly come to be thinking of the change that's happened in the United States and in other countries as sort of illustrations of a shift in power that I associate in my naive and underinformed way with the ideas of Max Weber. And I think it's fair to say you both come from traditions that at least are Weberian in their initial thinking. And my cartoonish picture of Max Weber's cycle of politics and power is that you have these eruptions of charismatic authority of various sorts, where it's the rule of the movement or the figure or the person that holds legitimacy, which then gets institutionalized or routinized, I think, into bureaucratic authority that then becomes removed from its connection to the initial source of legitimacy or authority and becomes a thing unto its own until the cycle begins again. And I'm sure that's a gross oversimplification, but I couldn't help thinking this last decade that we're seeing an explosion of this cycle. And in some of the things we're talking about now, it sounds like we're starting to see sort of the institutionalization of the Trump movement's charismatic authority into its own routinization and bureaucratization. I don't know where
react to, because I think what you're pointing at is two different dimensions, not necessarily the same. I mean, Anna's pointed out that this isn't now just about big government or in the administration of government or not. Although it is, I mean, the part about Max Weber, he certainly pointed out all the downside of living in a bureaucracy, and I feel that that's one of my sore points. Is I do feel that I think we need to do more to turn power back to ordinary citizens, and it might even involve challenging the rule of law sometimes, or certainly the administrative structures. But on the other hand, you do have this other side too, where it is a question not of how much power big government will have, as much as it is what you're going to use it for. And clearly the big fight, as you're pointing out, between certain states and certainly political parties, is whether you're going to use it for certain emerging issues that have not been even on the table before, namely climate, which requires major intervention and is now being curtailed. And also, I think AI is going to be the big drama. And let's not even talk about nuclear weapons, because that's been around so long that's not new. But what are you going to use your power for? And for Trump, it's a matter of of taking giving all the goodies to his buddies, frankly, and to the coal miners and whatever, or chicken farmers, I don't know, and for I don't even know who the
Or
leading Democrats are, but they would have much more. Certainly, the California guy Newsom would have more time for supporting climate issues and AI issues, I think. And so we're having a distinction between, is it big government itself that's a problem or the issue, or is it what you're going to do with big government, given the fact that you know damn well you're going to have it?
yeah, you're going to have it is a very important point too, right? That distinguished the people I wrote about in my own views, right, from, well, Steve Bannon calling for the deconstruction of the administration. That's partly rhetoric, but it's all over the Heritage Foundation report as well, and or you in our certain strains on the left certainly want to see a much diminished state in order, as you say, Metta, for a greater democratic element. But it is, I would say, actually, I would just tweak what you said, Metta, because I think that, I mean, I myself did make that distinction and said that, there's really not been there's an effort right now to get rid of large swaths of government, but not, as we know, the macro picture is deficits are going up, spending is going up, and military activity and at home and abroad is increasing. Certain sectors are ramping up. So, but it is this notion of the administrative state as the bogeyman and as a problem in and of itself. And my argument in the book is that formation really defines the whole of federal government. I mean, the thing itself is sort of subservient to an administrative structure at this point. That was not always the case, right? Headed by the president. And that's another thing we haven't talked about, which is, we have this separation of powers and mixed government. And the other thing that's going on, has been going on since the New Deal, frankly, with some blips, is a weakening Congress, the representative part of our democracy, the most important part. That's what we are, first and foremost. And then meanwhile, at the state level, go ahead.
You pointed out something I think very important about the weakening of Parliament, of Congress, which I don't really understand why that's happening. And I think that's very important, because the Congress now can't stand up to Trump no matter what. And I don't understand why. And I'm so much into things like promoting citizens' assemblies and other democratic methods of giving people some say-so about it.
Participation.
Yeah, but I think my fear is about the political parties. The political parties are just too powerful, and even they are not powerful.
They're very weak, actually.
In the United States, they're weaker than in any other country, for the simple fact that there's no other country in the world where a political party has no control over who's a member of the party or even who's a candidate for the party. I think that first became apparent when David Duke, became a figure in the Republican Party in the early 90s. And there were some Republicans who said, why don't we just kick him out of the party? And I think the courts ruled that under the way things are set up in the States, parties, there's no them who has control over who's in a party, which is a form of weakness, I would say.
I think, Metta, what is true, and maybe this is what you're getting at, is partisanship has grown dramatically, and this is documentable, right? And so it didn't used to be that people in parties would vote so much along, right? But that's not because the parties are strong. That's what's weird.
Okay, I take that point, but I think that the problem is money has to be channeled through,
Money. Yeah.
money has to be given to candidates, and candidates have to be party candidates. And so, independents, you got Bernie Sanders, and who else have you got?
There's someone else. There's the other senator in Maine, I think. Anyway, not the other. I know Bernie. I mean the other one, not the one we've been talking, not the seat we've been talking. The what was I gonna say? Oh, the weakness of Congress. One other thing, sorry, about candidates and all of that is that the Supreme. One thing I didn't foresee, and I don't really try to foresee all that much because I'm a historian. I tend to look backward rather than forward for whatever that's worth. But I didn't see a court that was so captured by such a right-wing ideological, so much of it. That's very unusual in our history that it would be that lopsided in either direction. The conservatives would say, oh, the Warren Court, but even that didn't have that. It had a somewhat narrow agenda that it was that they all agreed on and implemented. It was very important, but the role of the Supreme Court in actually enhancing the power of the president, and in some ways the administrative state, writ large, is a new development that I didn't see. But Congress, so that brings in the third branch, right? Congress. Another big scholarly influence on me is Ted Lowy, a political scientist, Cornell. He's retired. I hope he's still alive. I'm not sure. Who wrote in 1969, I think, the book called The End of Liberalism.
Oh, yes.
And his big concern then, as I said, there's a moment in the 60s, right, was too much over delegation by Congress of decision making and power to the executive and branch and the administrative agencies. It's really complicated, and there's not all that much time. I mean, why this has happened and so I won't get into it too much, except to say they could do better. Absolutely could do better, and it's really important because yes, the president is elected also, but that gets highly attenuated very quickly. And we have the Electoral College and yeah.
It's going to be hard to rebuild
It
the
is.
liberal administrative state. And aside from the question that hangs over your work, which is, should you in this way? Because I think the two things that we've learned these last 2 years are that there's two ways that, look, even a lot of quite right-wing conservatives now call this fascism, but that a very right-wing government can challenge the administrative state. One is to shut it down entirely, and certainly, the federal role in education and USAID and many other bodies of the state have just been eliminated. But the other one is to make it a direct executive instrument.
Yeah.
And to
Right.
politicize it in not just in its source of control, but in its very organic structure and so on, which certainly is the case of the Commerce Department, the Pentagon in many ways. And that's interesting because, of course, that was the critique of the administrative state that some of the scholars you mentioned in the 60s were concerned with, that in Vietnam, you had McNamara's turning the Pentagon into a General Motors of war for the president, or however it was phrased, and so on. So is it time to think about ways to organize institutional power that aren't so easily hijacked?
Yes, I think it is, and I think that I did a little research because I'm not as up on what the thinking is now about how to counteract this. Actually, before COVID, I was invited to a conference in Washington where we were going to discuss this, but then it didn't happen. part of it was in the context of the Supreme Court, actually, and does that need reforming? But that's kind of an external force that's that's reinforcing some of much of what the Trump administration is doing. I was interested to see on Reddit, of all places, and of course among academics, there is some very recent new thinking on this. I don't think we want to, those who don't like what's happening in the Trump administration, I don't think we want to just turn the tables entirely and say, let's reconstruct let's not deconstruct the state, let's make it more powerful. But I think that, one thing I've changed my mind on is independent agencies. I was a little concerned because they're so purely bureaucratic. They were supposed to not be so. The Federal Reserve is the best example, right? You don't want direct political control over that. And even the Supreme Court seems to be saying that's different. Why it's different, principally the principal legal principle.
You'd think there were a few more that there shouldn't be political control over. I mean,
yes, and that was the case in the 30s when these agencies really ballooned. Most the people supporting them, liberals, thought they needed more independence. I, from my academic perch but now I see, with a much stronger presidency, the advantages of that. And unfortunately, recently the Supreme Court decided no, the president should be able to remove, for any reason, the heads of these agencies. It just happened with the FTC. They're looking at members now too, and overturned a precedent from the 30s when they were trying to limit Roosevelt. Again, that liberal conservative axis just doesn't line up. So what is to be done? There is, one thing we've already mentioned, which is, coalitions among states to do their own sort of administrative work where it's been dismantled. Depoliticizing, as you said, some of the, presidentially appointed positions. That's an agenda item that'll have to wait. It's not going to happen.
And resisting the temptation to repoliticize in the other direction.
Exactly, because they're frankly, very, very complicated. But I'm someone who does like to see nuances, and it's just what I do. I'm really upset that the one area where this politicization versus expertise discussion is happening that you didn't mention, Doug, is in the OMB and an area close to my heart, grant making, just in general academic oversight, right? Because there's certain federal laws that give the federal government, regardless of what the Department of Education may be doing otherwise, a great deal of say, because the universities and researchers get a lot of federal money, or used to. So there's this big fight going on. It's very much an administrative state fight. There's one of the things they passed in the 40s was the Administrative Procedure Act, which was supposed to bring some light of day to rulemaking, which is, instead of lawmaking, the way, for the most part, that agencies do their stuff. Rulemaking is not a public process for the most part. Doesn't involve jurors or any kind of citizen participation, except in these limited way that through this law, these rules have to be published in the Federal Register now. And there are comment periods in which citizens can weigh in. And so the academic trade organizations, unions, others are urging, well, the period is closed as of yesterday, but people to say, that these new OMB rules, which are going to give more power to senior political authorities, should not happen, to be rejected.
I think we need to play with that a lot more, because I'd like to have a whole show about the rulemaking and the democratization of rulemaking.
Yes.
That's close to my heart. But we've used our time up, and so we need to come back another day and pick up this conversation and carry it forward, because we're right now at let's call it what Doug has called an inflection point. I think we're at a point where things are certainly happening, and we have to pay attention. So this is great fun, and I'm really grateful to you, Anne. And we'll be back in touch soon. Either of you want a quick parting word before I say goodbye?
Doug, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this in the context of a more global context, where because certain parts of it are, the populist, the charismatic stuff is certainly.
It's another conversation to have, but I've just been spending some time looking at the political effects of the post-Brexit years in the UK, when, of course, you had, another level of administrative authority that had inspired a revolt against it, which was the pooled sovereignty and anti-nationalist creation of economic administration in Brussels, and the political debates around the creation of that, and then of course the challenge of that, is a whole other interesting set of topics. And you probably can cite Jürgen Habermas in both the U.S. and the European cases in terms of arguing for the creation of these entities. But anyway, there are other forms of this tension going on, which have, of course, inspired their own challenges from the right. And this is a whole other interesting conversation to have.
Great. Yeah, I just wanted to get that in there for this particular podcast.
Yeah.
And also I'm interested in.
Okay, we'll come back together with probably some new players as well. But I can say goodbye to Anne for the moment.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a really great conversation. Thank you, Doug. And I wish all journalists were as well informed as you.
I'm better informed now. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.